Hello and welcome to the Thriving with Autism podcast. Today we're talking about how do you know when it's time to break up with your therapist? Therapy is a really important part of moving forward and making progress, but sometimes the relationship just seems to be a bit uncomfortable. So here's 6 ways to know when it might be time to break up with your therapist. So the first one is when you don't feel seen or heard. You feel like your therapist is not listening to you. They have their own ideas and they're not really that open to hearing your ideas or suggestions. And your ideas might be different to their ideas, and you feel forced or coerced into doing things their way. Therapy is supposed to be a collaboration. Not imposing someone else's ideas on you. Yeah, sure, there's a certain amount of expertise for speech, OT, psychologists even, but it should be a collaborative experience. If you don't feel that you're being listened to, maybe it's time to break up. The second thing is that you're feeling anxious and a sense of dread before the appointment. Now, honestly, when you start therapy, yeah, you're going to feel a little bit nervous. That's not unusual and to be expected. You're doing something different and you kind of don't know what's going to happen, but if that anxiety continues and you get anxious before they come, you worry about what happened after they leave, I wouldn't say that that was a really great experience for you, and it might be time to think about changing. Another alarm bell that goes off is when boundaries aren't respected. You're allowed to have boundaries. You're allowed to say no. And sometimes a common boundary that gets blurred is when the therapist becomes overly familiar and they might start talking about themselves and telling you about their family or problems with their boyfriend or girlfriend. That's crossing the line and that goes beyond the bounds of a professional relationship. Just keep in mind that the therapist is not your friend. You can be friendly, they can be friendly, but it's a professional relationship. Sometimes when a therapist or even a support worker or anybody that you're interacting with on a professional capacity, they're paid, sometimes the lines become a bit blurred, especially when you see them often and you get familiar. Sometimes that can make it really hard to break up because you feel guilty and you know too much about them and you start worrying about their feelings. That's not your job. They're there to be concerned about your feelings, not you worrying about their feelings. Don't be rude, obviously, but keep it professional. And then if you need to make a complaint or make a change, it's not going to be so awkward for you to do that. Another reason to break up is, maybe you've stopped seeing progress. Sometimes you don't see progress because maybe you've reached your goal. Congratulations, amazing. And if you have reached the goal that you were aiming for, and the therapist keeps on coming, it's wasting your funding, and it might be time to think about, in a nice way, just ending that relationship. You met your goal, you achieved what you wanted to achieve, and it might be time to move on. Another reason you might not be meeting your goals is that sometimes when you see a therapist for a long time, they get a bit stuck in a rut that they know all about it and here's what they're going to do, and it already hasn't been working. Sometimes that means that it's time to move on. It doesn't mean that they were a bad therapist, but sometimes it's good to have a fresh pair of eyes looking at your situation, hearing your story, and maybe coming at things from a different perspective or with some new and fresh ideas. Sometimes you might feel judged or blamed, and this is super common for parents and people with autism, is professional gaslighting. Maybe telling you, it's not that bad. Really? Are you sure it was like that? I'm sure it was a bit more like this. That's not quite right. You should be able to be in a judgment-free environment. That's one of the closely held ethical values of therapists, is that you don't feel judged. It's a non-judgmental, accepting environment, and you shouldn't be judged or blamed, whether you're the person receiving the therapy or you're the parent, and maybe the therapist is telling you that you're not trying hard enough. I can remember when our son was about 5 and I'd been seeing a psychologist trying to get an assessment done. And on the first session, she threatened him and said, if you keep that up, you can just go home. So he just went and stood at the door, ready to go home, because she said, go home. He's like, Beauty, that's where I want to be. I sure don't want to be here. And I said to my husband, look, I don't want to go again. How about you take him this time and see how you go? And so he took our son, and the therapist stood up and pointed her finger at my husband, who's over 6 foot, pointed her finger at him and said, if you were doing this consistently 100% of the time, this wouldn't be a problem. And so that's obviously blaming the parents. And my husband said, well, we've got 3 kids, not just 1 kid, and we've got other stuff to do. I'm not going to supervise him and do this 100% of the time. And that is actually unrealistic, right? If you're a parent, or even if you're not and you're doing therapy, you're not going to do it 100% of the time. It's unrealistic. And then blaming parents when the therapist doesn't get the outcome that they want. They make it your fault, sometimes because maybe they don't know what else to do. What can you do? Well, if you're brave, maybe braver than me, you might speak to them and say, I'd really like to stop therapy now and I'd like to consider my options. You could also say, I'm stopping this therapy now, like I'm going to have a break from OT and I'm going to do some speech. It doesn't have to be unkind. It's not a judgment on the person, although it might be from your point of view. But it's okay to say, I'm going to take a break and try something else. If you want a little bit more distance than that, you can just send an email and say, I'm giving therapy a break for a while. I'll let you know if I want to read book. Or the next thing you could do, if that's still too hard, you can always speak to your support coordinator and ask them to break up with your therapist for you, and they will handle that. That's one of the things that support coordinators do, so they can handle it for you. But one thing is for sure, you do not have to continue with a therapy that you don't like, that you're not enjoying, that you're not benefiting from. You don't have to continue with it, and it's quite okay to break up with your therapist. Thanks for listening. I'm Liz Smalley. Bye for now.
Welcome to a place where we rise, where we grow. Stories of courage the world needs to know. With Liz Smalley, we lift every voice. Educate, validate, advocate, celebrate, rejoice. Thriving with autism, our voices shine bright.